Thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to thank Tom Heron and Agri-Professionals for sponsoring their keynote speaker. So let's give them a round of applause and welcome Tom up from the podium.
Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see all of y'all, especially after last year. It's been 2 or 3 years since I've seen many of you, so it's wonderful. And just want to say thanks to CLA and all of you, our sponsorships, just a small token, and thank you for all the support you've given Ag-Professionals for almost 25 years. But Dr. Mitloehner, our speaker today, I first met him a couple years ago working on the California cattlemen's regulations, and I was very impressed. He has been defending our industry, and I've been following his work ever since. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Frank Mitloehner. He's from UC California, Davis, and he'll be joining us virtually today. But Dr. Mitloehner is the Professor in Air Quality Extension Specialist at the University of California, Davis, and he's done the math on the livestock industry's contribution to climate change. He is a professor in the Department of Animal Science, specializing in the measurement and the mitigation of airborne pollutants from livestock production, including greenhouse gases, VOCs, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and particulate matter. Dr. Mitloehner joins us for a closer look at the claims against our industry, against agriculture and what the other people are saying, and what he says is the truth behind cattle production and climate change. So please help me welcome Dr. Mitloehner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I wish I could be there in person today, but our travel restrictions, business restrictions still preclude me from doing so. Hopefully next year they'll be different. I will talk to you about livestock's path to what I call climate neutrality, a topic that's very timely because livestock is oftentimes accused of being one of the biggest culprits in affecting our climate. Needless to say, I have a beef with that. So the title of my talk is Rethinking Methane, Livestock's Path to Climate Neutrality. I will actually first talk about greenhouse gases and particularly methane, and then explain to you how our view around methane, which is, in my opinion, the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, how that view has changed, and give you some idea as to how livestock production can be not just less of a problem, but even a solution in our climate issues. With that, I will get going here. So I'm on Twitter. I was asked, why are you not on Twitter over a year ago? And I thought being on Twitter was a silly thing to do until I actually started my Twitter career, so to say. My Twitter handle is GHGGuru, you see it here. And since I have started, I have about 3 million people checking in my account every month. And so I can tell you, if you want to have impact and you are not on Twitter, then that's really something that you should rethink. My center, the CLEAR Center here at UC Davis, is also on Twitter, UC Davis CLEAR. Please follow us. If what I'm about to say here, particularly those remarks on methane, interest you, you should go to YouTube and put in Rethinking Methane, and you will find a 5-minute clip, a 5-minute video, YouTube video, that within a week earned about 150,000 views. It's a short video that explains in 5 minutes how our views on methane have changed. And if you think that methane is not that big a deal to you, and you're not that interested in that, think again, because in my opinion, this is our #1 environmental issue these days. If you want to hear a little bit longer interview, I was interviewed by a YouTuber about a couple weeks ago, and he interviewed me and then put a video out on YouTube, and it's called Eating Less Meat Won't Save the Planet. Here's why. And you see this hyperlink there? I don't expect you to remember that, but if you just put in Eating Less Meat Won't Save the Planet, you'll get there on YouTube. This YouTube video has been watched by close to 2 million people within 2 weeks. 2 million people have watched this 24-minute video interview of me, and it just shows how important social media have become, okay? So the print media will never have that kind of impact as social media have these days, and so I encourage you to check this out. Now, how come that there is so much confusion around livestock and greenhouse gases, livestock's impact on climate? Well, it is data presented in the way like this one. I know the font here is small, but let me tell you what this shows. It shows on the left side various different food items, from beef to lamb to cheese, and further down you see tomatoes, bananas, and so on. And on the x-axis you see greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product. Greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product. What does that mean? That means that they have simply compared, let's say, a pound of beef to a pound of tomatoes and a pound of bananas, and the greenhouse gases associated with that. Obviously, that is worse than an apples to oranges comparison. It's a beef to tomato comparison, comparing one of the most nutrient-dense food items to one of the most watery ones. How anybody could do that is beyond me. And even worse, this is not a US comparison of these different food items. It is a global comparison. So this includes US data as well as data from Germany, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and so on. When people now see this, a graph like that, they think, oh my gosh, look, beef is so bad. Beef has such a huge impact, so we should really not eat it. And if you look at beef, the top commodity there, you see a huge area of that beef being depicted in brown. And brown stands for methane's contribution to that greenhouse gas footprint. And you will see in a minute why that's important. As you can see, beef has a lot of brown. That means a lot of methane makes up the carbon footprint for beef. And as you will see in a minute, our views on methane have changed drastically. And I am spearheading the effort globally, and of course also here in the country, to make sure people understand why the way methane is quantified is inaccurate. Let me just give you a little analogy as to what they have done in this graph here, and pretty much all the graphs that you see these days in the media. Imagine somebody were to ask you the following question. What are the emissions, what are the greenhouse gas emissions of a car? Sounds like a simple question, right? But very soon, if you think about that question, you would probably come up with the answer, or with a follow-up question, which would be, well, a car. I mean, there are many different kinds of cars, right? What make and model? How old is the car? Where's the car driven? Is it driven in the mountains or in the desert or on a German Autobahn? Who drives the car? An 18-year-old or an 80-year-old? Is it an electric car? Is it a diesel? Is it a gasoline-powered car? All these questions have to be addressed before you even have a chance of answering the question of what the emissions are that are caused by a car, right? But guess what? The same is true for a cow. It makes all the difference in the world whether a cow is raised in parts of the United States, or in England, or in Kenya, or in Ethiopia. But data like this here lump it all together. Lump it all together. Not just are they comparing beef to tomatoes to bananas, very different, nutritiously different commodities, but they're using global data, and they're not taking into consideration the methane issue that I'm about to talk about. This slide here shows a global picture of all human-caused greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, I will talk about in a minute what they are, okay? What it means to be a greenhouse gas. In the whole world, there's approximately 49 gigatons of greenhouse gases that are emitted every year from all sources throughout the world. The United States contributes to 12% of all global greenhouse gases. That's all sources of the United States that you see here depicted in blue, in purple, and in gray. The 12% are comprised of the lion's share, fossil fuel sources, that's transport and power production and cement industry and so on. And then these two small slices here, the 0.5% is the livestock contribution from the United States, livestock production and consumption from the United States, and the gray is plant production and consumption from the United States, and how these two contribute to global greenhouse gases, okay? So those people who say all we need to do is change what we eat here in the United States, eat less animal source foods, and our climate issues will be drastically different, well, that is simply not the case, okay? The lion's share of greenhouse gases emitted by the United States are associated with the production and consumption of oil, coal, and gas, in short, fossil fuels. This slide, I think, is an important one. It shows the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, greenhouse gas inventory from 1990, pretty much until today. And what you see there, and I assume most of you are beef producers, what you see there in orange, at the very bottom there, is the contribution of the beef sector in the United States to total greenhouse gas emissions. In light blue, you see the remaining animal agricultural contributions to greenhouse gases, and then in purple, you see crop agricultural contributions. The total greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture is around 10% in the United States. Beef makes up around 3%. So the reason why I show this is because some of the activists out there, and unfortunately much of the media, reports on the beef contributions to climate as a major elephant in the room, when indeed it is clearly measurable, we know it's there, but it's certainly not what causes the main contributions of the United States to climate. First of all, what are greenhouse gases? These are gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. And when these gases are in the air, in the atmosphere, for example, because humans produce them by burning gas and diesel and so on, when these gases are in the air, they are hit by a solar beam from the sun, and then these gas molecules heat up. And they trap the heat from the sun. And that's what makes them a greenhouse gas. The more of these greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, the more heat from the sun is trapped in our atmosphere, and hence the warmer it becomes. Back in 1990, policymakers asked scientists to please come up with a matrix, with a way of calculating the impact of methane and nitrous oxide, two important greenhouse gases, versus CO2, carbon dioxide. And these scientists put out numbers, so-called global warming potential numbers, that convert methane and nitrous oxide into an equivalent amount of CO2. So this is like saying, if you were to go out for a drink with me, and one of us drinks Coke, the other one beer, the other one wine, and the fourth one vodka, we all drink the same volume, then you can compare how much alcohol each one of us has had by just looking at the percent alcohol in the drink, right? So that's what normalizes that comparison. In the case of greenhouse gases, you look at what's called the global warming potential. It's referred to as GWP 100. So if you want to compare methane or nitrous oxide to CO2, then you use these factors. For example, if your ranch has cows producing, let's say, 10 tons of methane, then what you do is multiply the 10 tons of methane from your ranch times 28. And then you arrive at 280 CO2 equivalent units. Okay, so you just need to multiply how much methane you produce times this factor there, 28. Okay, methane is the main gas associated with animal agriculture. That's what makes it such an important gas, okay? And I will now lead you through why the storyline around livestock's contribution to climate is really wrong and needs to be changed. Why? Because methane is very different from other greenhouse gases. Yes, it is very potent in trapping sun energy and therefore heat, but it is very different from the other gases insofar that it's not just produced, but it's also destroyed. And the other gases are not destroyed, but methane is. So what this slide here shows on the left side is part of the global methane budget. On the left side, you see different sources of methane, such as fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. And as you can see, this first half bubble on top shows that all sources in the world emit a total of 560 teragrams of methane, 558 to be precise. 558 teragrams of methane are produced globally, okay? And that's where the media normally stops reporting on methane. But look to the right side. You see that there are not just sources putting out methane, but on the right side, you see there are sinks that reduce methane. And they amount to 548 teragrams. So in other words, 558 are produced and 548 are destroyed. Meaning this red square there shows that globally a total of 10 teragrams is emitted every year. And that's a whole lot of a difference to that 558 that we see reported in the media all the time. So if you want to do the math correctly, then you need to subtract the sinks from the sources. And when you do that, you arrive at the correct net contributions. If you now look to the right side, you see a strong arrow pointing down, and it says underneath, sinks from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. What does that mean? That means that there's a way that methane is destroyed in the atmosphere. There is a molecule in the air called a radical, and when this radical sees methane, it destroys the methane, the so-called CH4, the methane, destroys it, and that happens within 10 years on average. Okay, so remember, methane is different from the other greenhouse gases because it's not just produced, it's also destroyed. And the destruction process is not accounted for with the current GWP 100 that I showed you on the previous slide. The GWP 100 is the way that all the greenhouse gases are currently compared to one another. Remember, the GWP 100 does not account for the fact that methane is also destroyed. And that is important because it determines that methane has a very short lifespan. Once methane is in the air, it takes approximately a decade and then methane is destroyed. In sharp contrast to, for example, carbon dioxide, which is in the air for 1,000 years, or nitrous oxide, well over 100 years. So CO2 and nitrous oxide are long-lived climate pollutants, and now that's important. Methane is a so-called short-lived climate pollutant. It is a potent greenhouse gas, but it lives only a very short period of time. So now comes something that's also very important, namely the so-called biogenic or biological carbon cycle. This is really important to know. Methane is CH4. Okay, that's chemically the chemical formula of methane is CH4. The C stands for carbon. And where does the carbon in the methane and the CH4 come from? Well, to explain that, we need to go back to what we learned in high school about photosynthesis. Or what do plants need to grow? Grasses or legumes. What do they need to grow? They need sunlight, they need a source of water, and they need a source of carbon. And the source of carbon is from atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide. The plants during photosynthesis take on that carbon, that CO2, and they convert it into carbohydrates, such as cellulose or starch. Then, let's say a steer, a heifer, whatever, comes along and eats the above ground vegetation, and then some of that carbon is converted into enteric methane. Okay, that's that methane that's belched out by our ruminant animals. Some of the methane also comes from the animal's manure. Is this carbon in the methane? Is this carbon in the methane new and additional, or is it recycled? And the answer is that a stable cattle herd will not add additional carbon to the atmosphere, but it will recycle existing carbon. Namely, the carbon in the methane originates from atmospheric CO2. That's the same carbon molecule, okay? Then after about a decade, that methane carbon is converted back into CO2 because these radicals destroy the methane. These radicals destroy the methane and convert the methane back into atmospheric CO2. So now you might ask me, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Didn't you just say that methane has a lifespan of about a decade and CO2 a lifespan of 1,000 years? Yes, that's true. But here, the question is not, is it good or bad? The question is, do our constant livestock herds add additional new carbon to the atmosphere? And hence, do they add additional new warming to our planet? And the answer is no. Constant livestock herds do not add additional warming to our planet. Why not? Because the same amount of carbon that's produced by our livestock is also destroyed throughout this process. This process, by the way, is called oxidation, the process that destroys methane. To be precise, it's called hydroxyl oxidation. The same amount of methane that's produced by constant herds is also destroyed. That means a constant herd does not add additional methane, but it keeps methane at constant level and hence warming at constant level. And that's referred to as the biogenic carbon cycle. This is really important. How is this different or similar to other greenhouse gas producing sectors? Let's say the fossil fuel sector that produces oil, coal, and gas. Well, it's very different. While this biogenic carbon cycle lasts for about 10 years, a decade, the fossil fuel situation is very different. Most climate scientists will tell you that by far the most important greenhouse gas causing sector is the sector around fossil fuels. What are fossil fuels? These are things such as oil, coal, and gas. And what are oil, coal, and gas? These are plant and animal material that a long time ago died, decayed, fossilized, and accumulated underground. And over the last 70 years, over the last 70 years, humans extracted half of all that carbon contained in the fossil fuels from the ground. And what did we do with that carbon, with those fossil fuel carbon molecules? We burned them. And by doing so, we're adding new and additional carbon to the atmosphere. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why globally CO2 levels go up. Because we take carbon from the ground and we burn it and add it to the atmosphere. That's a one-way street and it's not a cycle. And here on this slide, you see these two situations compared side by side. On the left side, the fossil fuel situation where carbon was contained in fossil fuels underground. We extracted them from the ground and then we burned them with cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, and so on. Adding new atmospheric or new carbon to the atmosphere. On the right side, it's kind of busy, but it's important. You see on the top there, atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. That CO2 is taken on by plants during photosynthesis. The above ground plant material takes on the CO2 during photosynthesis, and then that carbon in the CO2 goes into the roots, and from the roots via soil microbes into the soil. A process called soil carbon sequestration. So our grasses, for example, but all plants really, take CO2 out of the air and they store it in the ground where it stays unless we till the ground. So for example, if you have a ranch, then you take on more and more and more and more CO2 out of the atmosphere and you store the carbon contained in that CO2 in the ground. A process, again, referred to as soil carbon sequestration. Now take that. 1/3 of all human-caused carbon is stored in our soils. And livestock production can enhance soil carbon sequestration. So how? Well, a bovine comes along and eats above ground vegetation, then belches out some of that carbon in the form of methane. That methane is then converted back into CO2, and that's the cycle we talked about before. But what livestock also does is, after they eat that above ground vegetation, they are defecating and urinating, and by doing so, they're adding nutrients to the soil. And these very nutrients are the reason why the microbes in the soil are on high action. Okay, so when they have that additional nutrient enriched in the soil, then they can accelerate soil carbon sequestration. So on this slide, please remember The fossil fuel-related greenhouse gases are a one-way street from the ground up into the air, whereas livestock emits methane, but it's part of a biogenic carbon cycle. Unless we add additional livestock, meaning unless we grow our livestock herds by large numbers, we are not adding new additional carbon to the system. So now colleagues of mine from Oxford, around the scientist Miles Allen, Professor Allen from Oxford, said, you know what we do currently with methane is not right. By using this GWP 100, we are not taking into consideration that methane is naturally destroyed. And we should take that into consideration. Because if we don't, then we are painting a wrong picture. This new unit that Oxford University came up with is called GWP star. And it is designed to be a replacement of this old GWP 100 system. GWP star actually predicts what the impacts of methane are on global temperatures, on actual temperatures. These collaborators or these colleagues from Oxford estimated that the current way we are quantifying methane overestimates the impacts of methane by a factor of 4. So this new unit does take into consideration not just the production of methane, but also the destruction of methane, hence the so-called atmospheric removal. I will now explain the difference between CO2 and methane, and this is really important. It becomes a little technical, but it is an important distinction that people should know. On the right, on the base, you will always see the sources of what I'm going over here. What you see on this slide is first carbon dioxide and how carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. Let's say you were driving to work from home on day one, on Monday. When you do that, you burn gas and you put CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive again and you put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now on top of what you put out on Monday. And please remember, CO2 has a lifespan of 1,000 years. So when you burn gas, then the CO2 that you produce stays in the air for 1,000 years. Hence, every time you burn fossil fuel, it accumulates in the atmosphere. And hence, it's called a stock gas, because every time you burn fossil fuels, you add to the existing stock. Currently, methane is treated by all agencies as if it were a stock gas too, as if it were to accumulate in the atmosphere. But here comes the criticism of my colleagues in Oxford and myself into play, because we say methane is not a stock gas. Methane does not accumulate in the atmosphere because methane is not just produced but also destroyed. Hence, there is an atmospheric removal of methane. And the current regulatory environment does not take the removal of methane into consideration. Here's what methane looks like. The amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed are roughly in balance. As long as sources of methane stay stable, emissions of methane stay stable, and then the atmospheric concentration of methane stays stable, and then the warming of that methane remains stable. And that means methane is a totally different gas compared to CO2. I will give you a quick analogy. I love analogies because I think they really enhance learning. Imagine two bathtubs. One is a bathtub for CO2, and the other one is a bathtub for methane analogy. So imagine a bathtub that has a faucet but no drain. A faucet but no drain, and that's the analogy for CO2. Every time we turn on the faucet, water runs into the bathtub, and because there's no drain, the levels go up, go up, go up, go up. Regardless of how much you turn the faucet on, the levels will always go up. The other analogy, the one for methane, is a bathtub that has a faucet and a drain. If you turn on the faucet, normal, then the drain lets go of as much water as you add to the bathtub through the faucet. Okay, the drain is equivalent to the atmospheric removal of methane. Okay, so back to the bathtub. If you now crank up that bathtub, the faucet all the way, then you might add more water to the bathtub than the drain can let go of, and then the levels would rise. Where do we find that in the world? We find that in parts of the developing world. But we do not find that in most developed countries, such as the United States, where actually methane is going down. And that means you're turning the faucet down. It's still on, but you're turning it down. But your drain is still open. That atmospheric removal still occurs. And that means we can actually have those levels go down. Those water levels in the bathtub can go down. And in the real world, the methane levels can go down too. And when they do go down, then warming goes down. I will lead you through 3 different scenarios here and then show you what this old system GWP 100 predicts these 3 scenarios will look like. And then what the new unit GWP star would make these 3 scenarios look like. The first one is one where over 30 years, methane increases by, let's say, 35%. That's a strong increase of methane over 30 years. The second one is a stable scenario for methane, where methane remains largely the same or maybe decreases a little bit, let's say by 10%. And the third scenario is one where methane decreases strongly, let's say by 35%. These 3 scenarios are depicted using GWP 100, this current unit, in the following way. In the way that the increasing, the stable, and the decreasing methane will add significant amount of additional CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases. Okay? So all 3 scenarios, using the current regulatory framework, predict that greenhouse gases are added to the atmosphere at a large amount. But you clearly see here that the removal is not considered. This GWP 100 does not acknowledge that methane is naturally destroyed. And here comes the GWP star into play, this new unit from Oxford University that I think should be the new unit used globally. When we increase methane strongly, then indeed GWP star also predicts a strong increase in warming, which is depicted by this blue area north of the x-axis. But look at the second scenario. If you hold methane stable or even slightly reduce it, then you don't have additional warming. No blue north of the x-axis and a negative sign in front of the number. So that means there's no positive warming now, there's negative warming, a slight amount of negative warming. And that means negative warming is a fancy word for cooling. Look what happens when you reduce methane strongly, let's say by 35%. Then we are pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, which induces negative warming, or in other words, cooling. So as you can see here, a reduction of methane by 20, 30, 35% will be a potential solution to our climate issues. A solution to our climate issues. I show you one more technical slide and then I will become less technical. I want to show you how CO2 and methane warm our planet differently because the one is a stock gas and the other one is a flow gas. Imagine a power plant producing CO2 and imagine that power plant ramping up over 30 years in production. If it ramps up over 30 years, the CO2 will go up, the emissions will go up, and at the bottom you will see what the related warming will do. When the emissions of methane go up, then the warming goes up exponentially. Why? Because it's a stock gas. But if the methane, let's say from a feedlot, were to increase, let's say you have a feedlot with 10,000 and after 30 years that feedlot has 15,000 cattle, that means you would increase the amount of methane, then the related warming would go up linearly, not exponentially. If we look at constant emissions of a power plant or a feedlot over 30 years, then the constant emissions of CO2 would, and you see that at the bottom, lead to an increasing amount of warming. Why increasing? Because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. Every time you burn more, you add additional CO2 and that adds additional warming. But let's say our feedlot of 10,000 cattle were always a feedlot with 10,000 cattle, no increase or decrease, then a constant source of methane depicted on top would lead to a constant amount of warming, which you see at the bottom. But now comes what's interesting. What happens when you reduce both CO2 and methane? What happens to our climate? When you reduce CO2, let's say you're ramping down your power plant until you shut it down. Then, you see it at the bottom, the related warming still goes up all the way up until the point you shut down that power plant. At that point, when you shut down the power plant, the related warming will plateau, will no longer increase or decrease. It will plateau. That's the best we can do with CO2. But look what happens with methane. As soon as you reduce methane, you instantaneously decrease warming. Or, in other words, you induce cooling. This is the same effect that you would achieve if you were to plant a forest. And the forest trees taking out CO2 from the atmosphere, reducing net carbon emissions in the air. Okay? So, people ask me, Frank, do you think methane is a super pollutant? And then I say, in my opinion, CO2 is a super pollutant. Because not just does it live forever, for 1,000 years, once it's in the air, it stays there forever. But even if we reduce that gas, we still have increases in related warming. That makes it a super pollutant, in my opinion. In my opinion, methane is not a super pollutant, it's a super opportunity, because if we manage to reduce it, we induce immediate cooling. And that is one short-term tool to help us reduce our fight on global warming. Can this be done, is the question. Can we reduce methane, and can we do so at a large extent? Here in California, in the dairy industry, we have a great example where our regulators came up with a new rule that mandates a 40% reduction of methane, 40. 40% reduction of methane to be achieved by the year 2030, so in 10 years from now. At first, our farmers thought this is crazy, this can never be done. But then they learned that our state had some surprise. The surprise was that the state said, we are not using the cane approach of rules and regulations and fines to achieve that 40% reduction, but instead we use the carrot approach of incentivizing, financially incentivizing reductions of methane. And the state of California partnered with the dairy industry to reduce methane. For example, many of our dairies covered their lagoons. You see this here at the bottom right on this photo. See here a pretty typical California dairy, and the lagoon is covered, meaning the gases that would normally come off the lagoon, including methane, are now being trapped. This gas mixture, by the way, is called biogas. And then this biogas that's trapped is not burned and made into power like it was in the past, but it's converted into a form of fuel for vehicles. It's called renewable natural gas, or RNG. And this RNG fuel is then sold off to vehicle fleets like semi-trucks. Ladies and gentlemen, this conversion of biogas from dairies to fuel, which is called RNG, is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And as a result, it's incentivized financially very strongly. A system called the low carbon fuel standards was generated, and these low carbon fuel standard credits are very high, so high that many dairies are now covering their lagoons, trapping the biogas and producing fuel so that semi-trucks can burn that gas instead of diesel. And they get enumerated, they get paid for in a major way, $200 per ton of CO2e produced. And that's a huge amount. By the way, not just can producers in California benefit from this credit system, but throughout the United States. You can cover the lagoon, or in the case of a dairy, and sell your low carbon fuel standard credits to California, and you will get reimbursed for that. So far, our dairy system alone, and I know most of you are beef producers, but our dairy industry alone has reduced its carbon footprint by 25%. And that started 3 years ago. This is not some greenwashing or creative accounting. This has been validated by the state of California. These gases are metered, and the dairymen are reimbursed for the amount of gas produced. So not just is it possible, theoretically, it's being done, that we are reducing methane in a major way. So far, 25%. I have no doubt that we achieve a 40% reduction by the year 2030. Can this only be done here in California? Definitely not. It can be done anywhere. And can it only be done via manure? No. You can do this through other means. For example, reducing enteric emissions, which are the emissions caused by ruminant animals through the front end, through belching. We have studied, for example, feed additives that can reduce gases emitted through the mouth of these animals by anywhere between 10 to 50%. And on top of that, we have the manure potential, and we have the potential to store carbon in the ground through carbon sequestration. In my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, livestock production can be climate neutral, not carbon neutral, climate neutral within the foreseeable future. Our livestock industries need to get onto this, and need to get onto this quickly, because you have the potential to be a significant solution in the climate discussion of this country and worldwide. A couple of statistics. In the United States, we used to have 140 million beef cattle. Today we have much fewer, 90 million, so 50 million fewer. But we are producing the same amount of beef today as we used to with this much larger herd. Here you see on the x-axis the years, and then in orange, total slaughter numbers over the last 70 years, from 1970 to the last 50 years, from 1970 until now. So slaughter numbers have gone down, but look at production. That has gone up. We're doing much more with much less. Today we are producing 18%, 18% of the global beef with 6% of the global beef cattle here in the United States. 18% of the global beef with 6% of the global beef herd that's located here in the United States. We are world champions in producing beef, dairy, and other commodities. On the dairy side, we used to have 25 million dairy cows. We have 9 million. So we went from 25 to 9 million, but we are producing 60% more milk today, meaning the carbon footprint of a glass of milk has shrunk by 2/3 over the last 70 years. Same is true for pork. Here you see a tripling of pork production from 1960s until today, a tripling. I will now move us into a discussion around the so-called 2050 challenge. What is the 2050 challenge? The 2050 challenge is depicted on this slide. On the x-axis, you see the year 1750 to 2050, 2050 challenge. And on the z-axis, you see the total number of people in the world in billions. When I was a little boy, we were here at 3 billion people. Today, we are at 7.6. And by the time I'm an old man, we'll be at 9.5 billion people. Or in other words, throughout my lifetime, human population on our planet will have tripled. 3 times more people on our planet throughout our lifetime. Incredible. And if you look at orange, you see human population in developed countries, like the United States or most European countries. And in light blue, you see human population in developing countries, which is exploding, going through the roof. This slide here shows a satellite image of the world and a circle over South and Southeast Asia. And that circle contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside the circle than outside the circle. Truly astounding, and really showing where food security, or better said, food insecurity, is likely to happen. But it's not just these parts of Asia, it's particularly also Africa. If you look at Asia, Asia will increase by 41%, Africa by 50%, human population increase. The Americas are pretty stable, and Europe will slightly shrink. 2 hotspots will be South and Southeast Asia, and particularly Africa. And in Africa, those areas in red here are countries that double human population every decade, every 10 years. At the same time, their food production is dismal and decreasing, not increasing. So they're doubling human population while not producing increases in food production. And that obviously is a really bad situation. At the same time, we have this situation where you see here in color a relatively limited amount of arable land to grow food for people. Whether we have 3, 7, 9 or more billion people in the world, that's all the land we have to grow crops. Thank God we also have, in addition to this arable land, the so-called marginal land, which is grasslands. Because ruminant livestock exist, and the ruminants are the only ones that can make use of that cellulose-containing grass. Nobody else can digest that cellulose, but ruminant animals can. This slide here from the dairy side of things is an important one. It shows on the x-axis milk production per cow per year, and on the y-axis it shows the carbon footprint of milk production. Each little diamond here shows milk production and carbon intensity for a country. So there are roughly 200 countries in the world. Each diamond is one country. On the left side, you see there are many countries where milk production per cow per year is very low. And as a result, the carbon footprint is very high. Okay, these are countries like India or many African countries. The United States is not on this slide because we are well over 10 tons, and so we are off the scale here. But what this slide really shows is the lower the productivity of a cow, the higher is the environmental footprint, because the majority of the nutrients these animals consume go into maintenance and not into production. The more productive our animals are, the relatively lower is the emission intensity per unit of food produced, in this case milk. Same is true for meat, for eggs, and so on. On this slide, which is from the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, you see the carbon footprint of milk production in different regions in the world. And you see North America all the way to the left, we're the lowest, and then some development countries or regions in the center that have the highest environmental footprint, in this case, carbon footprint throughout the world. It is estimated that 70 to 80% of all greenhouse gases from livestock globally stem from developing countries. This is not finger pointing. This is just saying, hey, we have a lot of work to be done in parts of the world. In the developed world, we have knowledge to share, and it's time to do that. How can we reduce the environmental footprint of livestock? Four main tools. On the left side, you see 3 of them, and then in the center, the 4th. So it's improving reproductive efficiency. It's installing a veterinary system to prevent or treat diseases, improve genetics of animals and plants, and to feed more energy-dense diets. These 4 tools allow us to shrink the number of livestock to historic lows. And that's what I showed you in previous slides. It happened in beef, in dairy, it happens in pigs, it happens in poultry in the United States and other developed countries. One or several of these mitigation interventions are not occurring in much of the developing world, and that needs to change. This here is a slide again from the United States, total agricultural output versus input from shortly after the Second World War until now. What it shows is that while farm inputs have remained pretty stable, our productivity has gone through the roof, and that means we have learned to do much more with constant inputs. And that is the centerpiece of sustainability, doing more with less. And here we are world champions. We have nothing to hide. But for some reason, many farmers think we should hide. We should not hide. We should be very proud of what we have achieved. There are people who say agricultural productivity can never really get us out of climate change. We need to change what we eat. We all need to become vegetarians or vegans. Well, some people, thankfully, have done the math and showed us what would happen if a significant proportion of the United States were to do that, would change what we eat, what would happen to our climate. So this slide is to summarize that. If you were to go vegan for 1 year, from being an omnivore to go vegan for 1 year, then that would reduce by less than 1 ton, 0.8 tons of greenhouse gases. Is that a lot or not? Well, contrast that to 1 single flight per passenger from the United States to Europe. That generates 1.6 tons of greenhouse gases, meaning you have to go vegan for 2 years to the emissions cost when you fly to Europe per passenger. Okay, 1 flight equals 2 years worth of going vegan. If the entire United States, 330 million Americans, were to go vegan, we would reduce the carbon footprint of this country by 2.6%. 1 day less meat a week for the entire United States would reduce our carbon footprint by 0.3%. Is it nothing? No, it's not nothing, it's something, but I think everybody would agree it's quite minor indeed. If you were to be interested in how successful a vegan diet is currently, I want to refer you to this graph here, which stems from the Vegan Society of the United States, and it summarizes the so-called retention rate of veganism and vegetarianism. I learned that 84% of vegetarians and vegans 84%, abandon their diet after 1 year. After 1 year, they stop being vegetarians and vegans. Meaning, for every one active vegetarian and vegan in the United States, there are 5 former vegetarians and vegans in the United States. If that were such a sustainable and such a superior diet to follow, then more people would stick to it. Don't you think? I don't know what is missing, whether it's flavor or whether it's nutrients, but people don't stick to it. If you're interested in what the main contributing environmental harm is that our food system causes, it's depicted on this last slide. It shows that it shows here a average US family in front of all the food waste associated with that family. We're wasting about 40%, 40, of all food produced in this country. This number, 40%, is not just true for the United States, by the way, but in all developed countries, about 40% of all food is wasted. And even more surprisingly, even in developing countries of the third world, 40% of all food is never eaten. But in developing countries, it's not eaten because farmers can't get it off the fields, transport it, process it, and so on. Whereas in the developed world, these food wastes occur more at the consumer level. That's us at home and in restaurants. So with that, I gave you a long spiel here. I hope it was not too convoluted. I have a blog on my Clear Center webpage, which you find here, and I'm dealing with a lot of interesting rebuttal articles on all different kinds of things that are reported in the media and that I deem as being inaccurate. And of course, we have a webpage. My center, the Clear Center, has a webpage, and you find a lot of useful information on it, clear.ucdavis.edu. I want to remind you, my Twitter handle is GHGGuru, and I hope that you will join us and follow us. And with that, I come to a close, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Dr. Mitloehner, I thought I was going to see if you could comment on the size of operation, cattle, sustainability of, or comparing the sustainability of a small operation with a few cattle versus an operation with thousands of cattle.
You know, it's interesting. I was interviewed this morning by a reporter from Reuters who asked me the same question, because the notion is out there that size really matters, okay? The larger the operation, the worse for the environment. That is actually not the case. The question is not how large an operation is, but the question is how it's managed. I have seen feedlots with 100,000 cattle that send all of their manure to some organic farms, small organic farms in Salinas. In fact, the entire Salinas Valley of California, which produces well over 50% of all vegetables in the United States, fertilizes their crops with animal manure. And that animal manure stems from 1 or 2 feedlots. Okay, so if you now take a shot of a feedlot, it looks like, wow, this is massive, this is really big. But the question is, how and when do you apply those nutrients to crops? It's not how much is produced, but how you manage that. I have seen small farms where the farmers didn't have the means to buy proper equipment, have the staff that's well trained and so on. And as a result, they had quite some environmental issues. I've also seen small ones that were excellent. And I've seen the same for large operations. I've seen shipwrecks, and I've seen a lot of them that do really well. I don't think the size is what is the determining factor for proper environmental management. I think it's the management.
Dr. Mitloehner, this GWP star way of calculating greenhouse gas potential is a very new process, and it sounds very scientifically founded, but how do we get those out there in the world who don't want to believe such matters, or that believe that animal agriculture is a major contributor, how do we win them over to showing them that this is more tangible science or more accurate science than GWP 100?
Yeah, an excellent question. So first of all, make no mistake that there's a huge anti-front for livestock throughout the world. Okay, and this is not just here in the United States; it's everywhere. Switzerland, New Zealand, Uruguay, you name it. What I presented to you, this GWP star, is a new matrix that was developed by atmospheric scientists from Oxford University who have no link to animal agriculture whatsoever. All they care about is that we quantify methane correctly and that we don't just look at how much methane is produced, but also the fact that there's an atmospheric removal process of methane. And that's where the GWP star came into play. Now, the maker of GWP star is one of the senior authors of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. His name is Miles Allen, a professor from Oxford, as I said. Several of the co-authors of this matrix, GWP star, are also IPCC members. And I presented what I presented to you today to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. And they were so taken by this and by the significant potential mistake they have made for so long that they installed a global task force consisting of 60 top-level scientists. I'm one of them that have or are working on this biogenic methane as we speak. The report and the final recommendations of this FAO task force will come out within the next 2 months. So I cannot tell you exactly what will happen, but what I can tell you is that there is now a big discussion going on as to why we are not taking into consideration the fact that methane is not just produced, but also destroyed. This is almost like you going to your bank and saying to your banker, listen, from now on, we'll only talk about my income and not my expenses. This is ridiculous, okay? And this has been happening to livestock forever, and it's time to change that. Not to greenwash, but to accurately account for what the true contributions are of livestock to climate and what our potentials are to actually be a solution provider. And I need all of you to assist me with that.
Are there any further questions? We have one.
One of maybe the concern with greenhouse gases and climate change is increasing global temperatures. And with what you presented, it seems in California, you're looking at a 25% reduction in emissions. If we were to do that across the country, would we impact global warming, if you will, increase in temperatures? And also, if there were no livestock in the United States and no emissions at all, what would that do to the increase in temperatures?
So first of all, a reduction of methane leads to a situation where we pull carbon out of the air, and that has a net cooling effect. So I believe that the livestock sector in the United States is capable of what we're doing here in California for sure. The question is, will politics incentivize, financially reimburse farmers to be part of a solution? For example, by improving soil health, or by feeding feed additives, or by doing something to the animal manure. We can reduce methane, and when we do, we pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And here comes the important thing. When we reduce methane, then that reduction of methane counteracts other greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide or CO2 to an extent where within the foreseeable future, we reach a point of climate neutrality, where the reduction of methane counteracts other greenhouse gases so that overall a sector can have a zero impact on warming. And this is really important because the Paris Climate Accord that we are now a member of again has as a goal to not increase additional warming globally. If we reach climate neutrality in the beef sector, in the dairy sector, and others in the United States, then that means these sectors no longer have any negative impact on climate. And if we reduce methane strongly enough, then we can even be a solution counteracting some of the fossil fuel related emissions. So your question was multifaceted. The other one was, what if there weren't any livestock? Well, I just recently went on a long trip from California to Wyoming, and I saw how big a bison is. And 150 years ago, we had many of those, 60 and 40 million antelope in the United States. Most of them were killed off, and over time replaced with large domesticated livestock. In the past, we had 100 million large ruminant wild animals, and today we have around 100 million domesticated ones, 90 million beef, around 9 million dairy. So we have pretty much replaced the wild ruminants with domesticated ruminants. Overall, the methane from 150 years ago versus the methane from today on the ruminant side has not really changed.
Anyone else? Last chance. Here comes one.
I know your research focuses on methane, but one of the other significant criticisms of the livestock industry is all of the carbon emissions from grain and feed going into cattle that are not grass-fed. So I know that's not your area of expertise, but I mean, what's your outlook and hope and industry progress in addressing that concern, or are there other, are the examples of different analysis that needs done on that side as well?
Yeah, so I do deal with that as well, because I'm interested in the livestock sector, and of course, feedlots and so on are part of the sector, is an important part of that. So what I presented here today was the biogenic carbon cycle with animals eating grass, right? So grazing animals. But if animals eat corn, well, guess what? Corn is also just a grass. And while the corn grew, it also took CO2 out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. The issue with corn production is not that. The issue with corn production is that sooner or later we plow that field, we till that field, and take the carbon that the corn had assimilated and put it back into the atmosphere. Okay, it's not stored in the ground when we grow corn. That's the one aspect of it. But the other aspect is the following. If you, for example, compare grass-finished animals with corn-finished animals, then we know that the corn-finished animals will go to slaughter much sooner than their grass-finished peers. So corn-finished steer in California goes to slaughter at 14 to 16 months of age, and a grass-finished steer goes to slaughter almost twice that age, at 26 to 30 months of age. So the difference in lifespan is significant in the amount of methane they produce, but also the time in the feedlot, the last 4 months of their lives, those animals ate a diet that does not lend itself to producing methane, because the methane is by and large the enteric methane coming from the mouth, and that is generated by the animal's microbes digesting roughage. These methanogens need roughage to produce methane. The more they produce. So, contrary to public belief, feedlot finished steers do not have a higher carbon footprint than grass finished steers. In fact, it might even be lower, even if you consider the greenhouse gases associated with the production and the transport of things such as corn and other feed items.
Anyone else? Looks like
I really
about to
encourage
wrap
you
this
to
up.
go visit the. I would really encourage you to go visit this
thank you, Dr.
webpage.
Mitloehner, for that very insightful educational presentation, and thank you again, agri-professionals, for sponsoring this speaker. Please join me in a round of applause for both of these